All right, so a burgeoning startup scene in Auckland. So how can other countries follow New Zealand's example and make life a little bit easier for businesses? I'm joined by Augusto Lopez Claros. He's the director of the World Bank's Global Indicators Group. Augusto, first of all, we've seen Singapore and New Zealand vying for these top spots. What has New Zealand done that Singapore perhaps hasn't to earn this top spot?
You know, there is not a huge gap between the two, and Singapore has been #1 for many, many years, and it is still a place where it is easy to do business. I think that, in fact, this year, Singapore had actually more reforms than New Zealand did. But New Zealand has done extremely well in a number of areas covered by doing business, and I think it's because it has a government that is very friendly to business. It's a government that sees itself very much in the role of creating a framework for the private sector so that it will encourage entrepreneurship, it will create jobs, it will contribute to prosperity and economic activity.
It's a beautiful country, and as you say, it always gives off this idea of stability and so on, so it's perhaps no surprise that it would be an easy place to do business. But I often think it's so far away, and yet Singapore is ideally placed for all sorts of different things in global trade.
Right.
Is it a case that perhaps New Zealand is attractive for startups, for people who just need a laptop to work off and an internet connection, rather than somewhere that you might be thinking to seriously start an import and export business?
Actually, New Zealand does well, not just in starting a business, which is one of the indicators that we track in doing business, but they do well across a whole range of areas. You know, they are #1 in the world, but in the 10 indicators that we cover, they have first place in 5 of them, which is highly unusual. They have a very good environment protecting minority investors. It's easy to start up a construction and get a permit. Our indicator of getting credit, they are #1 in the world. So it's actually, their approach has been very broad-based in terms of creating an environment for the business community that is friendly, that is conducive to economic activity. Now, it is true, it is a bit out of the way, but we're not going to hold that against them, right? The fact is that for the 5 million people who live in New Zealand and for the thousands and thousands of entrepreneurs who want to get started and do business, the government is on their side.
It does, yeah, it does look good. I often think about the little details, and I often think about this example when we talk about easy doing business. When I lived in Paris, I remember a very condescending lady at HSBC telling me I needed to send a fax, and I explained that I hadn't sent a fax since I think the late 1990s. This was only about 4 years ago. These are the kind of little details, aren't they? These little obstacles that countries can put in place that make all the difference, because that used to drive me crazy.
Yeah, I think that one important factor in explaining the success of many of the doing business top performers is basically how the government sees itself in its relationship with the private sector, right? Does it see itself as an enabler, right, of the private sector, as the institution that sets the rules that then make it possible for the private sector to thrive, or does it see itself more in the role of controller, right?
And that's quite a hard balance to strike.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that the countries near the top that have done well are countries where the government, by and large, sees itself as an enabler, as the setter of the rules that are sensible and transparent and easy to follow, because ultimately they are interested in a thriving private sector, because that's going to boost tax collection and it's going to enable, in turn, the government, to do good economic policy.
One thing I noticed you're doing more of is looking at the obstacles for women who are starting up business, gender. I'm ashamed to say I never really considered that women can have a harder time in court, for example, with testimony. People don't really think about this kind of thing. Right. It remains or can be a challenging environment for women.
Absolutely, absolutely. We have data for 173 countries, and in 155 countries, women face some kind of obstacle in terms of their property rights, in terms of their access to the job market, or other kinds of restrictions. So this year in doing business, what we are doing is, in those countries where it is more difficult for women, to do business, whether it is starting up a company or getting a national identity card or using property as collateral to access the financial system, we are penalizing countries, for these restrictions, as a way of presenting or giving countries an inducement to do away with some of these restrictions, which make no economic sense. To restrict half of the population through legal means, is something that is going to undermine productivity and competitiveness.
Just briefly, if you were advising any of these countries to try and move up this list, what 3 things would you tell them to change or do immediately?
I think that the first thing, there has to be a kind of a mental change where the government recognizes the importance of the private sector as an engine of economic growth. 90% of all the jobs in the world are actually created in the private sector. And so the moment the government sees itself in its role as the setter of reasonable and transparent rules that are going to encourage the private sector to thrive, you make an important sort of mental transition. Now, obviously, one of the beauties of the doing business indicators is that they capture different dimensions of the business environment, and countries that have done well are countries that have worked on a whole range of areas, and have tried to improve there. For instance, the use of some of the latest technologies to facilitate processes for the business community has been a very important factor across the world.
So
being able to pay taxes online and that sort of thing.
This is key then, being able to do all of this potentially on your smartphone. We'll have to leave it there. Augusto Lopez Claros, many thanks indeed for talking to us.